you all for being here, and I hope if you saw that the topic of this lecture was history, and you didn't moan and groan and say, oh, bother, we gotta sit through somebody talking about the olden days. I'm really hoping today that what I can do for you is show you how history is all around you, how you are as much a part of that historic continuum as anybody who was here when the signing of the Portsmouth Compact happened in 1638. And I want you to understand that as you walk these roads, walk these paths, travel through the golf course, walk the campus at Portsmouth Abbey, that you are part of that continuum on this landscape, and the clues to that landscape are all around you. So I hope by the time we finish today, you'll get some little nuggets that you can take with you and maybe impress your parents when they come for a little campus tour next time. To start with, this picture that's behind me is an aerial photograph that was taken in 1941, and it shows this pattern of the cultural landscape that's here. The cultural landscape is a landscape that's been manipulated by people, and in this case, there's a range of cultures that have crossed these shores and crossed what is now the campus of Portsmouth Abbey School to shape what it is and how it's known today. So we're going to look at this overall history, and as I say, it's a quick view because we don't have a lot of time, but I hope it'll inspire you to come and look for some more. And if you want to talk about any particular periods of this, we can do that in more detail at another time. Interestingly, that it's hard for me to take you all the way back to the Native Americans and the landscape of the Narragansetts, but there's a couple of places where we can do that. And one of them is here. This is Queen's Island. It's a small little island of about 10 acres just off the coast of Wickford over in North Kingstown on the other side of the bay. But images like this really, I think, help us to understand and portray what Verrazzano saw when he first came up and cruised up through Narragansett Bay at the very beginning of European contact and exploration. And he described this landscape that he saw coming through here that was not as much wilderness as you might imagine today. He said, there the fields extend for 25 to 30 leagues. They're open and free of any obstacles or trees, and so fertile that any kind of seed would produce excellent crops. Then we entered the forest, which could be penetrated even by a large army. We found apples, plums, filberts, many kinds of fruit different from ours. There's an enormous number of animals, stags, deer, lynx, and other species. The harbor mouth faces south, and it extends 12 leagues in a northeasterly direction, and then widens out to form a long bay. In this bay are 5 small islands, all very fertile and beautiful, full of tall spreading trees, and any large fleet could ride safely among them without fear of tempest or other dangers. It's hard for us when we take a car or a plane or a train or a bus to get here to think about what it was like to approach these grounds from the water, but these descriptions of Narragansett Bay continue for almost 200 years up until the 1630s when Portsmouth begins its settlement. And a lot of it is talking about this open landscape that's been very carefully manipulated by the Narragansett Indians for hundreds of years before the Europeans arrived. It's consistently talked about as the garden of this section of the New World. And they talk a lot about the sheltered harbor and this mosaic of both field and woodland with no underbrush and understory to it, landscape that's been manipulated to maximize the number of birds and the number of wildlife capable for hunting. Now there's a whole series of wonderful maps, if you're into cartography, that start to show what Rhode Island is all about. And interesting, for the first couple of hundred years of mapping of Narragansett Bay, the maps all look like this. And so if you imagine, oh, I'm sorry, let's go back. If you imagine, I don't think I can get this to work, but you see that little arm that points down? You can always find the arm of Massachusetts anywhere you look. If you think about coming from Europe and exploring the New World, a lot of these maps were essentially tipped on their side rather than north being at the top of the map. So we have to reorient ourselves. But you begin to see the kind of landscape that they're documenting, and you also begin to see the kind of settlement that's going on. So this map from 1677, Portsmouth has already been settled for 40 years, and you begin to see the major trading posts in particular that are the key reason for people to stop here, coming and going. A lot of the early settlement here at the Bay was for beaver pelts and establishing relationships between the Narragansett Indians and the Dutch primarily, who are taking a lot of those raw materials back to Europe. Interestingly enough, what we really also inherit from the Narragansetts is a lot of our place names that we're so familiar with. So Aquidneck is a Narragansett name. Connecticut, which is the name of Jamestown, is another Narragansett name. And in Rhode Island, more than any other place, that heritage of place names has descended all the way to the present day, more so than any of the Wampanoag names on Martha's Vineyard or out on Cape Cod or the Stockbridge Indians out in the Berkshires. So another piece of this heritage. And if you begin to look at the definition for some of these place names, you'll begin to discover some of the natural resources that were there. That is why those names were born. So another way of being able to look at the landscape, even through language. Now in 1643, Roger Williams wrote a book called A Key to the Language of the Americas. And his hope was that these new visitors and these new explorers and these new settlers would begin to talk to the Narragansetts in their own language. And the way of being able to do that was to build this key that could translate their language into the language of the Europeans. But what he also did was he documented those elements that were most valuable to that culture. And so you see this whole series of words that are important to the Narragansetts. A lot of them have to do with corn and worn out fields, new fields, fresh meadows, and so forth. But a whole series of definitions for what the landscape looked like in the 1640s when this is all being written by Roger Williams. His trading post, by the way, was over at right there in Wickford. Now it's called Smith's Castle, but he sold it to his friend Richard Smith, and it became a very active port for trade on the other side of the bay, with a constant connection back and forth, mostly to Newport, but back and forth across this bay as this wealth of natural resources yielded a whole economy for Narragansett Bay, for Portsmouth, for Newport, and for North Kingstown alike. Now, if you come into the later 17th and the 18th century, there is a huge dichotomy that happens, and that is that a landscape that was defined by the descriptions of its natural resources begins to be described in metes and bounds in the European tradition of buying 5 acres or 10 acres, not the fishing grounds off of the southwest corner of the point of Connecticut. So there's all of a sudden a different pattern that emerges on the landscape, and this European aspect of what the landscape was to be, and landscape as wealth by the number of acres you own, is what really shaped the visual remains of what we see as the landscape at Portsmouth Abbey today. So this definition of stone walls and fields and house lots and homesteads, all separated and defined by the kind of tillage or mowing or orchard or woodland that were all carefully worked through based on the soils that were there, is something that came about by the end of the 17th century, and it still pervades the island today. This is a wonderful mapping of the lands around the Concord River in Concord, Massachusetts, done by Brian Donohue. Someday, I would love to see somebody from the student body do a similar kind of an exercise for Portsmouth and really have us look at what that landscape really looked like. But he's looking at these settlement patterns, the uses of the land, the kinds of soils, and the kind of development that happens around colonial husbandry. And the idea is that you can build a farm operation that allows you to support your family and maybe have a little bit of extra to sell away and create a life here that would last for more than one generation, so generation after generation, and really a whole documented system of organic farming that we're going back to today, especially with some of the community-supported agriculture programs that are out there. If you start to look at that land study centered around Portsmouth, in 1777, when General Prescott was captured just down the road here, you see this scout who maps this landscape of Portsmouth, and you see here the same kind of thing. Orchards, woodland, open fields, all very important from a military standpoint, because where can you find the cover and where can you bring your men from the shore of the bay up to Prescott's house and capture him without him seeing you coming? And as part of that study that we did for the golf course, we created this series of maps. So there were 4 of them altogether that were created. And we took both military maps, that diary of William Mackenzie that I just showed you, lots of very specific period data, and applied it to this 1938 aerial and created a series of images of this changing landscape so that you could see how it changed over 4 centuries. This happens to be the one for the 18th century. And so what you see here is a lot of open space and some carefully delineated small husbandry-type farms. The Freeborn Farm, not very far behind where the manor house is today, the Boyd Farm, a lot of the names of the lanes and the small road systems that are here through the Abbey grounds are named after some of these early, late 17th and early 18th century farmers. And you'll see these change as we go through this little talk. Now, the other thing that happened, because Aquidneck Island, which was also called Rhode Island, was so small, it became very sophisticated. And those fertile grounds that they kept talking about became very important gentleman farms, particularly by the mid-18th century. So by the 1740s to the 1770s, just prior to the Revolutionary War, there emerged this whole pattern of large farms, some of which you're familiar with and you don't know it. Vaucluse is one, if you've been out to Sandy Point Beach at all. Whitehall is still a historic house down in Middletown. And then the Redwood Farm and Redwood Library. Redwood Farm was here in Portsmouth. Redwood Library was founded in the 1740s out of Abraham Redwood's library collection and is still there in downtown Newport today. A very important educational institution. Wind power. In the rest of Rhode Island, there is such a good resource of good rivers that could power grist mills, power sawmills, and power the industry that built these communities. But here on Aquidneck Island, there's not enough change in topography, and there's not enough strength to those streams and rivers to be able to drive water mills. And so windmills became incredibly important. And this tradition of windmills that you have here on the Abbey grounds goes all the way back to the 18th century. Mostly they powered grist mills, sawmills, and then pumped water up to be able to water and feed not only households, but some of the farmland and the farm animals that were here. As I mentioned, Newport begins to emerge really as the capital of sophisticated life and the capital of economy for Rhode Island and the capital of social life here in the island and also in what became the state of Rhode Island. So by the time of the Revolutionary War, there emerged Newport as a real notable capital of life in New England and in the New World, with its synagogues and its the Quaker Meeting House. The synagogue is the earliest synagogue in the country and the earliest congregants in the country. The Abraham Redwood's Library, as I mentioned before, lots of very important hallmarks of both religious and social life that still exist today, especially down in downtown Newport. Now, this Battle of Rhode Island that occurred here on the grounds of what is now the golf course was not a very good battle for the American forces. In fact, they lost, they ran away. But there was an active battleground going on, and you don't appreciate the military and strategic significance of this battle until you take your walk or your car and you drive up out of Newport and you realize that the land is very slowly ascending, and by the time you get up to Portsmouth, there are a series of heights here that became very important for this military battle. The Americans were hoping to relieve the siege that the British troops had on Newport. They were hoping to free Newport and open it back up as a colonial port. Newport, the British troops had captured it. They'd been there for 2 years. They devastated the island, and they were anxious to try to free Newport. But they needed the help of the French to be able to do that, and the French ships were slow to come. So they enticed the British to march up the island. They encountered them here at Portsmouth, on the Portsmouth Abbey grounds, and then they quickly realized they were outnumbered, and so they left, and they took boats back across to Bristol. And the British stayed on the island a little longer until the French fleets could come and relieve the island of the British troops. What they left behind, however, in being here for those 2 years on an island with finite resources and having to feed and heat and provide heat for thousands of British troops, was very much a devastated landscape when they left behind. And some of the saddest descriptions of the island's landscape really come from this period after 1777 up until the 1820s, when the devastation that was wrought by all of these people here and especially the amount of wood that they needed to both feed and to heat the troops was a real impact on this island. So here's just a couple of descriptions just to give you some sense of how terrible this was. In 1794, One visitor wrote, "The troops of Britain, like the locusts of Africa, have withered each tree upon this once happy island. And when they departed, they left the inhabitants no shrubs under whose shade they might rest themselves in peace. Their industry begins to allow them to rise up some, to defend from the summer sun, though at great expense, as they have all the trees to buy in and bring back to the island." Even in the 1820s, another visitor came and said, "The British destroyed for fuel about 900 buildings, to be sure the poorer sort, yet it has never recovered the dilapidation. The town of Providence has risen to riches and elegance from the ruins of this once beautiful spot, while Newport resembles an old battered shield. Its scars and bruises are deep and indelible. The wharves are deserted, and the lamp in the synagogue is extinct, and the people are now so poor that not more than 10 or a dozen people would have the courage to invite a stranger to his table." So really a very, very different kind of a landscape. And so by the end of the 19th century, as Portsmouth rises and the industrial heritage of Rhode Island grows and prospers, fueled by all of those great rivers in the rest of the state, Aquidneck Island gets left behind. And yet, the same thing that drew Verrazzano and some of the early settlers to come here, the beauty of this island and the fertility of this island, is what began to reemerge again in the early 19th century and draw people back here again. And it is this scenery that spawned a whole opportunity for artists, for academic professors who had the summer off, and for those that wanted to explore this now 2-century-old remains of this great lifestyle that had been on this island, and begin to capture it in paintings and talk about it and write about it and begin to build a body of people now that wanted to come back to this island for its scenic beauty. One of those spots that became one of the most popular picnic spots in the 19th century was the Glen. And you have a chance now to go over to the Glen on the other side of the island here in Portsmouth. It's owned by the city of Portsmouth. And if you go down along the shore of the bay and you follow this little stream back up, you will find the ruins of this old mill. It's quite an incredibly beautiful, very romantic spot to be. And this mill ruins was what drew a lot of the picnickers in the 19th century and brought people back to Portsmouth in particular to find this lovely spot, to have a drive out of Newport and then have a picnic. But beyond that, there is a whole range of incredibly great American art that emerged out of this island in the 19th century. And you can still today travel taking those paintings in hand and find those same spots on this landscape that inspired some of this great artwork. Paradise Rocks was a very popular place for painting, and that is still very much part of that area right around the beaches in Middletown, Newport today. But lots of beautiful shoreline images and lots of images of a decaying agricultural economy surrounded by this incredibly beautiful scenery. And you can imagine by the end of the 19th century how that then began to draw all those summer folks who became a new cash crop for the inhabitants here on the island to be able to build a summer colony in Newport that rivaled none and far surpassed most every place else on the East Coast. Part of that was the building of this building in 1864. This was built for the Amos Smith family. It's now your manor house here on the grounds. And it became a very important gentleman's farm with all of the fancy barns and outbuildings that went with it. But it was really designed as a summer home. So those 22 rooms that are now part of the girls' dorm and the admissions office and all of the spaces in that building were designed by New York architect Richard Upjohn, a very, very important architect for his day, and still dominate that lower part of your campus today. And around it continued some of this farming. And here's the little gatehouse and those gates that you drive through almost every day, seen here at the end of the 19th century with the beautiful patterning on the gates themselves, all part of the summer house that was here where the manor house is now. The train came up from Newport, so it made it very accessible to think about a lot of Portsmouth becoming summer homes for some of these great wealthy individuals, especially those that wanted to get outside of the social fray of Newport. It was a real hotbed of gossip. And if you moved out of the city a little bit, you were able to distance yourself a little from that. So this is the little train stop that existed at the end of Corey's Lane, and you can still see the evidence of some of the foundation there today. But it allowed you to be able to take a ship to Newport, get off, then get on the train, train and very easily come up here to the shores of the Smiths estate and spend the summer. Green Animals happened at the same time, another big estate where St. Philomena's School is, all centered around this little node of the connection to the train. The other thing that happened in the 19th century was a real interest in exploring the fertility of the island again, but in a brand new way. So rather than raising sheep and raising horses and raising cows, an interest in really creating the stock and the seed source for a horticultural industry here on the island, fed primarily to help to landscape a lot of those big fancy houses that were coming in, but also to build a new kind of an agricultural industry centered on horticulture rather than agriculture. And this still pervades the island today, and all the greenhouse complexes and the rows and rows of nursery fields that you see are all part of this wholesale industry that developed out of the mid-19th century. Places like Galvin's Botanical Garden or Hookendorn's all begin, and they have shops in downtown Newport. Not only do they connect those residents with plant material, but they supply gardeners, mostly from Ireland and Scotland, that came through these places and then out to become the gardeners on these major estates. And so this island, unlike many other parts of Rhode Island, has an incredible wealth of diversity in its horticultural material. And now with this plant material being 100 or 125 years old, you're starting to see the last days of some of these trees and some of these incredible specimens that the island's been known for so long. So as we look to plant a new generation and build on this horticultural legacy, it becomes important for us to think about that for the next generation of those students that are coming to the school. Here's another image. Now you can start to see by the 19th century how things are, there's more houses here, but it's still a very open agricultural landscape. And just north of, let me see if I can make this work. Let's see, do we see this one here? To the far right of the picture, that road that you see that cuts across that lower corner, that is Corey's Lane. And you can see how now the lane comes through that V, and the right-hand fork of that V goes down, and then it connects to the manor house that you know today, and that's part of that driveway that you travel on a daily basis today. And then behind that, towards where that little pond is where you can see the remains of the old Freeborn farm. Just up through the picture, where in the very center of the picture you see the big orchard and another farm complex, that was the Anthony Seed Farm. And that essentially occupied a lot of the area just north of the monastery now and north of the church. Big, long, very, very important seed operation where they're again producing plant material and growing seed for propagation for this horticultural industry. The other thing that happens in the 19th century is this interest in natural resources, and so underground resources become very important. And at Arnold's Point, where that large tower is now beyond the Carnegie Abbey grounds, was a big coal operation and mining operation. And it is all of the mines, the mine tunnels, that were filled and filled with water that now irrigate all of the land that is now the Portsmouth Abbey golf course. But again, lasted for almost a century, started in the 1820s and went up until about 1905. And kind of that fits and starts. The coal, the anthracite that's here is not very good. And so it was used for industrial purposes, but could not be used for heating homes. The manor house gets sold to the Halls, and then finally in 1918, part by gift and part by sale, the farm and its 70 acres becomes what is now the core of Portsmouth Abbey. For almost 10 years, it operated as an abbey with a tenant farmer that was farming a lot of the land in and around the main house. And then in 1926, the school comes and buildings get added to what is now the right of that picture in the lower part of the screen that become the core of the monastery, chapel, the library, and some of the school itself. This is an image of what that farm looked like, so we can track all these histories through all these different resources as well as look at what's left on the grounds. And if you want to have some fun, you could wander around the grounds down by the manor house and find a lot of old foundations that related to these early school buildings as well as some of the outbuildings that were part of that farm. Your art building is a barn, a former barn that was part of this manor house and this big estate that was kept for agricultural purposes and then later turned into your new art building. The farm that was just taken down, the barn building that was just taken down not very long ago, was part of another farm complex and another part of this agricultural life that pervaded most of the 20th century here, both in and around the school as the school developed. And then you can see the series of aerials that watch the school as it grows and as it develops, and it builds this incredible campus that you all walk through and in and around today. And as you begin to look at some of these photographs, watch some of the evidence of that agricultural life as it disappears, both the open fields for hay, for cultivating corn, and then the orchards. And they gradually disappear to give way to a lot of these buildings as the campus itself began to grow. And you see generations here of the school that don't have some of the buildings that you even know today, and you can watch them as they change and as they grow. I'm hoping that you can have some fun really studying these photographs as time goes along later on and see some of these changes. They really represent an incredible legacy for the school, with a lot of attention to great architecture, to good scholastic buildings that are inspiring for you all to live and study in, and this sensitivity to this larger landscape that's all around the buildings themselves. And now by the 20th century, you see the whole pod of the school now developing there at the end of Corey's Lane, both in and around and then up the hill from what had been the Hall Manor House. And you see this transformation that takes place. And you can see, as the 20th century progressed, this encroachment of the woodland that happens in all of the land that eventually became the Portsmouth Abbey Golf Course. Just so that you remember that even in my lifetime, these are some images that I've taken of this campus over the last 20 years. But obviously the gates that you come through every day, now part of that 19th century gentleman's estate, the old barn building that's now gone, and then all of these agricultural fields that you pass on your way down the hill. And what kind of agriculture will happen on those fields now, or whether they'll become part of the grassy meadowlands and open space that also pervaded a lot of this landscape for the past 400 years, is a good question. But it's, again, part of that legacy that's really transcended your life here for 400 years. This is one of my favorite pictures, because you'll find it hard to believe that this is actually the Portsmouth Golf Course before the golf course came in. So imagine trying to get people to understand what this landscape looked like when you can barely see it through all the green briar and the multiflora roses and the underbrush that sprang up. I think in its lifetime, Aquidneck Island wants to be a very heavily wooded island. And without this constant manipulation by the Narragansetts and then later by these waves of different settlers that have been here and worked this landscape, it has created that open space that's so beautiful and so familiar today. But constantly New England wants to become woods. And some of the cellar holes and the wells and the evidence of these old farming nodes are really important cultural resources and part of the artifacts that are left both within the golf course as well as around the school grounds today for you to discover. So if you find some of these lanes, you see some of these old stone-lined walls, and you look at the field patterns here, even as you're playing baseball or playing football or going to the hockey rink, you can see that evidence of that legacy around you. And so I hope what you'll do as you take away these little thoughts and think about this larger landscape is that you'll start to appreciate what William Hoskins, who's a cultural geographer from England, has to say about our knowledge of our surroundings and how it can continually be heightened and better understood if we go back and we revisit some of these places in the past. He says, one may liken the landscape to a symphony, which it's possible to enjoy as an architectural mass of sound, beautiful or impressive as the case may be, without being able to analyze it in detail or to see the logical development of its structure. The enjoyment can be real, but it is limited in scope, and in the last resort, vaguely diffused in emotion. But if instead of hearing merely a symphonic mass of sound, we're able to isolate the themes as they enter, to see how one by one they're intricately woven together, and by what magic new harmonies are produced, we can perceive the manifold subtle variations on a single theme, however disguised they may be, and then the total effect is immeasurably enhanced. Only when we know all the themes and the harmonies can we begin to appreciate its full beauty and discover in it new subtleties each time we visit it. If you think about the development of this landscape here at Portsmouth Abbey, much as though it were a piece of music or a series of compositions of varying magnitude, you can begin to understand the logic that lies behind the beautiful whole. And I hope in the end, you can start to think about history that's something that's alive, that's discoverable, and that leaves you clues of your surroundings every day that you can begin to ask questions about and pick up on and learn from and want to go discover more. Thank you. There's a lot of interest in the Viking Tower. So this is that stone remain that I showed you in the windmill picture that sits down at Truro Park down in Newport. And I can tell you that when 1492 came out, and this story about the Vikings and the influence that they had here in New England, there was a lot of speculation that that remain was part of an old Viking structure, and it was not the remains of an old windmill. But I have a lot of friends that are archaeologists that worked in and around the park very recently, within the last couple of years, that have proved that in fact that is an 18th century structure, and it more than likely was part of the base of a windmill or a grist mill, and not part of the Viking legacy, although it's really nice to think and romantic to envision what that was. Part of my job lately is trying to get people to understand the value of ruins, not only from a romantic aspect, because they're so evocative when you go and you explore around them, but really as an understanding of change and the durability of some of the things that we build and we create. And I think one of the most important parts of that base that's in Truro Park is that legacy of that ruin and the testament to great construction that that's really all about. And then part of the fun for me is the stories and the romance that circulates around, that creates what we often call tradition, that isn't always necessarily based on fact, but creates some of the best stories that we have to be able to tell each other. As far as I know, those tunnels don't extend under the campus, but they've created, he asked about the coal mine tunnels. So the coal mine itself was positioned down at Arnold's Point, which by the way is supposed to be the site where the Portsmouth Compact was signed. And that is the site where that tower is now, that you can see as you look out across the landscape there to the north. The tunnels extended along the bay and up the hill underneath that section in and around where that tower is today, so it really filled more of the area that is now part of the golf course than extending all the way over to here. But it became a really important resource when the golf course operators were looking to build the golf course here, because fresh water and enough well water to power the irrigation of a lot of those greens for the golf course was a real problem. So the fact that these could be flooded, could be an underground cistern system basically for them, became an important part of that story. And if you go over and look around carefully, you may find remains of some foundations and some evidence of those systems, but they definitely were part of the underground. They also mined copper there for a little while, but it was a very short-lived mining operation for that. Anything else? So the question is, did I discover any other grave sites on the property? And I think, Brother Joseph, there's 4 family cemeteries on? So there's 4 family cemeteries on land that's owned by Portsmouth Abbey now. All small. So you've got your own monastic cemetery here on the campus. There's a Freeborn family cemetery. The Boyd family has a cemetery. There's another small cemetery on Corey's Lane now as you come down the road. And there probably are more that we don't know about, but we tried to map and document all of those smaller cemeteries and the graves that are there as, again, another cultural resource for the property.
There's also the battlefield cemetery.
Oh yes, and the battlefield cemetery. So there's something called Hessian's Hole that has about as many stories around it and speculation of exactly where it is as anything else. But when that Battle of Rhode Island took place, there were a lot of German soldiers that were hired and paid to work with the British troops here. And so apparently some of them lost their lives in that Battle of Rhode Island. And the story is that they were all buried right there near the battlefield. And so there's a small depression as you head up towards West Main Road out of the golf course that is believed to be where Hessian's Hole is. But they did a little bit of testing with the archaeologists and have not found specific evidence of graves. But I can certainly tell you that around the Quaker Meeting House, there are a lot of graves that are there from the British troops that were housed at the Quaker Meeting House that have no tombstones on top of them or anything else. So it is true that as we dig new buildings and we build new things here at the Abbey, or the golf course does anything with their building stock, then that is definitely a resource that we always have to pay attention to. Okay.